The wind clawed across the high country, stripping branches bare and driving snow in sharp needles against Hazel Wickham's cheeks. The reins slipped in her raw hands as she urged the old mare forward, the wagon wheels sinking into drifts that grew deeper with every mile. Her breath came in clouds that stung her throat, and the sting of it reminded her of words once spoken by her husband's kin: foolish, helpless, cursed widow. Those words seemed carved into her bones more deeply than the cold, and tonight they bit harder as she fought the storm alone. The mare balked near a bend where the road thinned, and Hazel snapped the reins, fear riding her more than determination. She wanted the cabin's meager walls, the iron stove, the single quilt left to her. She wanted shelter from this endless white world that cared nothing for her grief. Yet as the wagon lurched and groaned, she saw a dark mass in the snow ahead, a shape too still to be anything but dying. Her heart seized. She could have guided the mare around it and pressed on. No one would know, and the storm was already taking her strength. But something rooted her in place. The figure was enormous, shoulders broad even collapsed in the drift, chest bare though snow lashed across skin the color of weathered earth. Long hair, white as frost, spread across the ground like a flag surrendered. Hazel's lips parted in a whisper. An Apache. The stories returned quick as breath. Men in town calling them predators, women clutching children close, the sheriff speaking of raids long past as if they still loomed at every ridge. Her first instinct was terror. She glanced at the rifle in the wagon bed, but the man's chest rose in a shuddering breath, faint, uneven. He was not a monster now, only a man broken by cold. The mare snorted, anxious, as if urging her to decide. Hazel dropped the reins and stepped into the drift. Snow swallowed her skirt to the knees, numbing her legs, yet she pushed forward, clutching her wool cloak tight. She knelt beside him, and the storm's roar seemed to hush for a moment. His lips were blue, eyelids fluttering, lashes white with frost. He looked older yet not feeble. His body was carved with the memory of battles, scars cutting across muscle, but life still clung to him with stubborn thread. Her hands trembled as she pulled the cloak from her shoulders and laid it across him. Foolish. Reckless. She would pay for this mercy. Still she whispered, "Hold on. Please." Words he could not understand perhaps, but they spilled from her anyway, the only defense against the silence of death. It took all her strength to drag him, inch by inch, to the wagon. Each pull stole her breath, each pause threatened to undo her resolve. By the time she managed to roll him onto the boards, her limbs shook as though hollow. The mare stamped impatiently, snow piling on her mane, and Hazel scrambled back to the seat. She cracked the reins with a cry, and the wagon groaned back onto the trail, carrying them both deeper into the storm. The world narrowed to the sound of hooves crunching ice, the rattle of wood, and the low rasp of the man's breathing behind her. She dared not turn often, but once she did and saw him shivering beneath her cloak, lips moving as if caught in prayer. It unsettled her, yet also steadied something within. She was no longer the only soul clinging to life against the night. Time bled strange in the storm. She remembered flashes, the lantern swinging from the wagon, throwing ghostly arcs, the sting of sleet down her collar, the memory of Emma Boone's sneer last week, "You'll waste away alone, Hazel, like the foolish girl you are." That voice almost broke her resolve, yet the weight of the man in her wagon seemed to rebuke it. If she could save him, perhaps she could save herself from that sentence. At last, through the curtain of snow, the shape of her cabin emerged. Tilted roof burdened by white, chimney leaning but still promising warmth. Relief nearly dropped her to her knees when she pulled the mare to a halt. She stumbled down, fighting the wind to open the cabin door. The air inside was bitter, but not cruel like the storm. She dragged him again, shoulders aching, muscles screaming. By the time she rolled him beside the hearth, her chest burned with fire of its own. Her fingers fumbled flint to strike flame. The stove caught with grudging sparks, then a steady glow. She fed it wood until the room began to thaw. Kneeling beside him, she pulled the cloak tighter across his frame. Up close, the scars on his chest told of both violence and survival. Slashes, punctures, reminders of battles survived when others had fallen. She brushed melting snow from his hair, and his eyes flickered open, startling her. They were dark, fathomless, and for a moment fear surged again. But they did not hold malice, only the dazed confusion of one hovering between worlds. He studied her face, his lips moving without sound. Hazel whispered, "Rest," though she knew he might not understand. She rose to fetch water, poured it carefully between his cracked lips. His throat worked, swallowing with effort. His gaze did not leave her, as if memorizing the sight of her face. When the fire warmed the room to something bearable, she sat on the edge of the rocker across from him, rifle still close at hand. The storm battered the cabin walls, but inside another storm brewed, the clash between her fear and the strange, fragile mercy that tethered her to him. Her thoughts wandered to the town, to how Elias Boone would seize this as proof of her folly if he ever found out. She could almost hear the laughter at the general store, the hiss of judgment curling like smoke. Shame pricked at her, as cruel as the cold. Yet when her gaze drifted back to the man on her floor, she felt another thing stir. Something nameless, a chord struck deep, as though their survival had braided them together in ways unseen. The fire snapped, shadows dancing over the cabin walls. Hazel folded her arms across her chest, shivering though heat now licked her skin. The man's eyes had closed again, his breathing steadier but shallow still. She told herself she would keep watch only until dawn, that she would send him away when the storm eased, and no one would know. But even as the promise shaped itself, she knew it rang hollow. The storm wailed, and her cabin seemed smaller than ever, two strangers bound by mercy and danger. Hazel's hand rested on the rifle, yet her eyes lingered on the rise and fall of his chest, the sound of his breath mingling with the hiss of wind outside. She leaned back in the rocker, heart heavy with fear and something else she dared not name. The night stretched long, and in that fragile silence between the fire's crackle and the storm's fury, she realized she had not only saved him, she had bound her fate to his. And when the gale pressed hardest against the cabin, rattling the shutters as if the world itself tested her choice, she thought she heard his voice, low and hoarse, whisper a word she could not understand. Yet it sounded perilously close to her name. Dawn broke pale through the frost-rimmed window, a dim light that seemed more suggestion than warmth. Hazel stirred from the rocker, neck stiff, her body aching from the storm's ordeal. For a moment she forgot the weight of last night's choice, until her eyes fell on the figure stretched before the stove. The cloak she had laid over him had slipped, revealing the breadth of his chest, the rise and fall of shallow breaths. Alive still. Against reason, against storm, alive. She moved quietly, as if sudden sound might break whatever fragile thread tethered him to this world. Kneeling, she touched his wrist, startled by the strength that pulsed faintly beneath the skin. His eyelids fluttered open, dark eyes fixing on her with a clarity that hadn't been there before. She almost recoiled, yet his gaze held no threat, only the exhaustion of a man long at war with the elements. Hazel poured water into a chipped cup and lifted it to his lips. He drank, though the effort was halting, each swallow an act of will. When she drew the cup away, his voice rasped, rough as gravel yet threaded with dignity. "Chenoa." The name lingered in the air like smoke. Hazel repeated it under her breath, uncertain of the sound on her tongue. He gave a faint nod, then closed his eyes again, as though speaking it had cost him dearly. Hazel sat back, whispering her own name into the silence. Hazel, though she doubted he caught it. Still, it felt necessary, as if names might stitch them more firmly into the same fragile moment. The cabin creaked under the weight of snow. Hazel rose to stir embers in the stove, coaxing the fire back to life. She set broth to simmer, its scent filling the space with meager comfort. Behind her she heard the faint shuffle of movement. When she turned, Chenoa had pushed himself to sit, leaning heavily against the wall, cloak clutched tight about his shoulders. The effort left him trembling, but his posture carried a certain unyielding pride, a refusal to be seen entirely broken. Hazel carried a bowl to him, crouched low to offer the spoon. His hand lifted, scarred and large, as if to take it from her, yet weakness betrayed him. She steadied his hand with her own, guiding broth to his lips. Their fingers brushed, sending a jolt through her she could not name. He accepted the nourishment silently, each sip measured. When he caught her watching, his eyes lingered on hers longer than comfort allowed. She looked away quickly, embarrassed by the heat rising to her cheeks. Outside, the storm had not relented. The wind moaned through the trees, shaking the shutters as though determined to break in. Hazel's mare stamped restlessly in the shed, the sound carrying faint through the walls. Hazel rose to fetch another log, and when she turned back, Chenoa's gaze was on her hands, chapped, reddened, bearing the quiet history of toil and loss. She wondered if he recognized in them the story of a woman discarded by kin, surviving by scraps and stubborn will. The day crawled. Hazel busied herself with chores, though each task carried the weight of unease. She chopped vegetables with the rifle within reach, swept the floor though her eyes often flicked to him. Yet as hours stretched, she noticed the way he watched the fire more than her, as if guarding it against the cold, his presence less a threat than an anchor. By afternoon, a shadow darkened the cabin door. Hazel's heart leapt to her throat as she opened it to Elias Boone. His eyes swept the room, taking in the sight of the giant Apache propped by her hearth. Elias's lip curled. "So it's true," he muttered. "You've taken in one of them." His voice dripped with the satisfaction of having caught her in sin. Hazel stammered, words catching. He would have frozen. Elias's gaze hardened. "Mercy's wasted on savages. Folk will hear of this, Hazel. They'll say you've lost your mind, maybe worse." He spat in the snow and stalked away, leaving the door swinging open to the storm. Hazel slammed it shut, back pressed against the wood as dread washed over her. Chenoa had not moved, but his eyes followed her with steady calm. He did not ask what Elias had said, yet something in his expression suggested he understood. Shame burned her cheeks. She wanted to explain, to defend herself, but words tangled useless in her throat. Instead, she sat heavily in the rocker, silence stretching taut between them. Evening fell, the light outside paling to blue, then black. Hazel lit the lamp, its glow soft across the rough-hewn walls. Chenoa shifted closer to the fire, his strength returning in small increments. At one point, when the wind rattled the chimney violently, he rose with effort and braced the shutters, hammering them back into place with hands still strong despite his weakness. Hazel watched, a strange ache in her chest. He was not only her burden. He was already mending what she had left broken. Later, as Hazel sat sewing a tear in her sleeve, Chenoa's voice broke the quiet, low and measured. "You, alone." The words startled her. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." The single word carried all her grief, the weight of a widow unloved by family and scorned by neighbors. He studied her face, then bowed his head slightly, as if in recognition. No pity, no judgment, just acknowledgement. That small gesture pierced deeper than any sermon of comfort she had endured since her husband's death. When the lamp flickered low, Hazel gathered courage to speak. "They'll talk about this," she murmured. "About you here." Her voice trembled. She did not know if he understood fully, but his eyes lifted steady, and for the first time she saw something like resolve within them, a quiet defiance that mirrored her own. The storm eased toward midnight, its howl softening to a muffled hush. Hazel stood by the window, staring into the pale vastness outside, while behind her the firelight wrapped Chenoa in amber glow. She felt the weight of choice pressing down, whether to send him away when morning came, or to risk the scorn of neighbors for a man she did not yet know. Her hand gripped the sill, nails biting into wood. She turned, heart caught in her throat, and found him watching her with eyes dark as the night beyond. No words passed, yet something unspoken bound the air between them, as tangible as the fire's warmth. For the first time in years, she did not feel utterly alone. Hazel blew out the lamp, the room swallowed in half-dark. The storm had calmed, but another had begun within her, a stirring she could neither trust nor silence. And as she lay on the narrow bed, staring into shadows, she knew dawn would not ease the weight of her decision. For tomorrow, the town would know, and the mercy she had chosen tonight would change everything. The storm relented by morning, leaving the world blanketed in a silence almost too pure to trust. Hazel stepped out with her bucket, breath pluming in the brittle air, boots sinking into powder that gleamed like shards of glass. The sky was a dull pewter, promising more snow before long. She bent to draw water from the well, and when she straightened, her gaze drifted back to the cabin window. Behind the frost-edged glass, she glimpsed the tall figure moving slow but steady, placing another log into the stove. Already he was claiming space within her life, his presence marking the room that once felt so hollow. Inside, the air was warmer, laced with the scent of broth and cedar smoke. Chenoa sat near the hearth, his cloak drawn close, yet his eyes followed her with quiet clarity. Hazel poured water into a basin and set it beside him. He dipped his hands, scarred and weather-worn, into the cold, then lifted droplets to his face, letting them streak down like a baptism. She found herself watching the ritual, her chest tightening with a feeling she dared not name. It was later that morning, when she hitched her mare and headed into town for flour and salt, that the first sting of gossip struck. The general store smelled of lamp oil and tobacco, and the stove in the corner hissed with damp logs. Emma Boone was there, wrapped in a fur-lined shawl, her eyes narrowing as soon as Hazel stepped inside. "You look worn," Emma said, words sharp as pins. "Storm treat you rough?" Hazel managed a nod, forcing her focus on the shelves. "I'll take a sack of flour." Emma's lips curved in a smile that never touched her eyes. "Funny thing, Elias came home muttering about seeing smoke at your cabin. Said he thought he caught sight of a stranger through the window. Big fellow. Dark-skinned. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Heat rushed to Hazel's cheeks. She fumbled coins onto the counter, murmuring, "You hear plenty of things that aren't true." Emma leaned closer, voice dropping. "Careful, Hazel. A widow's reputation is fragile. Keep company with the wrong sort, and folk might start saying you've lost all sense." The words clung like burrs. Hazel left quickly, flour heavy in her arms, the weight of judgment heavier still. On the ride home, the trees seemed to close in around her, branches bending beneath snow as though echoing her shame. She thought of her husband's kin, their scorn when she'd chosen to live alone rather than return to their charity. Now this, whispers that she was harboring danger under her roof. When she reached the cabin, she found Chenoa outside, splitting logs with a borrowed axe. His movements were deliberate, powerful even in weakness, each swing clean despite the tremor that sometimes caught his shoulders. The sight struck her. This man, thought by the town to be threat, was stacking her woodpile with careful order. He straightened when he saw her, sweat beading despite the cold. She offered him water, and for a moment their eyes met. In his gaze she found neither pity nor demand, only a solemn recognition of her struggle, as if he understood more than language allowed. That evening, as firelight painted the cabin in amber tones, Hazel dared to ask, "Why were you alone, out there?" Her voice trembled, uncertain if he could piece together her meaning. He was silent a long while. Then, with halting English, he answered, "Tribe, no want. Hair white. Say ghost. Settlers, no want. Say enemy." He pressed a scarred hand to his chest. "Between." Hazel's throat tightened. Cast out by both sides. She felt the echo of his words deep within herself. Widow. Foolish girl. Cursed luck. Between. The same exile, though from different worlds. She whispered, "I know that place." Her voice cracked, and she turned quickly to the fire, ashamed of her tears. But when she glanced back, Chenoa was watching her with eyes dark and steady, not with judgment but with a quiet kinship that spoke louder than any comfort offered since her husband's death. The days stretched, winter tightening its grip. Hazel and Chenoa moved around each other in a rhythm of silence, her cooking, his mending of fence posts, her sewing, his quiet labor stacking wood or patching the roof. Words were scarce, but gestures filled the space. The way he left a pile of kindling by the door without being asked, the way she set an extra spoon of sugar in his cup of coffee, though supplies were thin. Each act was a thread, weaving something fragile between them. Yet the world beyond the cabin walls grew less forgiving. On her next trip to town, whispers followed her like smoke. Men at the blacksmith shop paused in their hammering to watch her pass. Women at the pump drew their shawls tighter, muttering beneath their breath. Elias Boone greeted her with a smirk, his tone heavy with warning. Storm's not the only thing folks are talking about these days. Shame gnawed at her, yet defiance stirred too. That night, as she watched Chenoa kneel in the snow, head bowed in prayer, she wondered if perhaps mercy itself was a rebellion worth the cost. One evening, returning from the shed, Hazel found him seated outside despite the cold, face lifted toward the drifting stars. Snow clung to his hair, turning it silver against the dark. His lips moved in words she couldn't understand, yet the cadence was unmistakably prayer. She stood in the doorway, breath caught. He was not praying for himself. She knew it by the way his gaze shifted toward the cabin, toward her. The realization struck her with such force she nearly staggered. In that moment, fear and shame gave way to something deeper. The fragile, terrifying knowledge that this man, cast out and scorned like her, carried her safety in his thoughts. She wrapped her arms around herself, unsure whether to step closer or retreat. Instead she lingered, letting the scene carve itself into her memory. When at last he lowered his head and turned, their eyes met across the dark. No words bridged the distance, yet the air between them felt alive, charged with something unspoken. Hazel's heart thudded against her ribs, a rhythm she could not silence. She slipped back inside, bolting the door against the cold, though she knew the true storm now lay not in the snow, but in the gaze that lingered behind her, and the choice that loomed closer with every passing day. The days shortened until dusk seemed to fall almost before the sun had risen. Hazel found herself counting hours by the way the fire dimmed and flared, by the crunch of Chenoa's boots outside as he split logs, by the silence that lingered between them, and yet grew less heavy with each passing moment. The storm had sealed them into a world of two, and though fear still pressed at her chest, it was no longer the fear of him. It was the fear of what the town would do when they learned she had not sent him away. One morning, Sheriff Amos Kearney rode up as she was scattering grain for the mare. His horse steamed in the cold, hooves darkening the snow. He sat high in the saddle, his gray beard rimed with frost, his eyes carrying both weariness and judgment. "Hazel," he called, his voice carrying the weight of law and rumor. "I hear you've taken in an Indian." Her hands froze on the bucket. "I saved a man from the storm. He was dying." The sheriff's gaze did not soften. "Dying or not, folks won't take kindly to it. I'll warn you once. Send him on his way before the men decide to do it for you." He tipped his hat, spurred his horse, and was gone before she found words to answer. That night, she repeated his warning aloud while Chenoa mended the rocker by the hearth, the fire painting his scarred face in gold and shadow. He looked up at her, listening, though she wasn't sure how much he understood. Still, his eyes told her he grasped the heart of it, that his presence endangered her. She half expected him to rise, to say he would leave. Instead, he drove the last nail into the chair with quiet precision, then set it gently beside her. The gesture said more than words could. He would not abandon the place that had given him shelter. Her hands shook as she lowered herself into the rocker, testing its steadiness. It no longer wobbled. The thought struck her with painful clarity. In mending her chair, he was mending more than wood. He was stitching dignity back into a life frayed by loss and scorn. She could not decide whether to be grateful or afraid. The town's whispers thickened like smoke. Emma Boone stopped Hazel outside the church one Sunday, her voice dripping honeyed poison. "You bring shame on yourself, girl. A widow alone is pitted. But a widow who keeps an Apache under her roof? That's scandal. Don't think your husband would be proud." Hazel walked home beneath the heavy toll of the bell, each clang echoing her shame. Yet when she opened the cabin door and saw Chenoa bent over the fire, stirring a pot of beans he had tended in her absence, she felt something soften. No one in town had ever tended her hunger so simply, so wordlessly. She sat, the scent of smoke and salt filling the space, and for the first time in years, she felt like someone had been waiting for her return. The days unfolded in a rhythm half domestic, half defiant. Hazel swept the cabin while Chenoa patched the roof. He chopped wood while she mended shirts. She never told him when she went to town, yet when she came back, he was always near the door, as though he'd kept vigil in her absence. She began to notice how silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the silence of those who had grown used to one another's presence. One evening, while feeding the mare, Hazel slipped on the ice and cried out. In an instant, Chenoa was there, catching her by the arm before she struck the ground. The touch lingered longer than necessity demanded. She felt the steadiness in his grip, the warmth of skin against hers, and her heart fluttered like a bird trapped in her ribs. She pulled back quickly, murmuring thanks, but the echo of his touch remained long into the night. The storm returned with ferocity that week, rattling the shutters and pressing snow hard against the walls. Hazel and Chenoa moved close to the stove, sharing the narrow warmth. At one point she dozed, head heavy against her hand, until the crash of wind startled her awake. She found his eyes on her, studying her face as though it were a map he had long sought to understand. She wanted to look away, but something in his gaze pinned her. Gentle, unyielding, the gaze of a man who had nothing left to lose but the truth of what he felt. That same night, voices rose outside. Men, shouting through the storm. Hazel stiffened, rushing to the window. Lantern light flickered through the trees, and Elias Boone's voice rang clear. "We'll not have an Indian taking root here. Best come out, Hazel, and send him off before we do it for you." Her blood ran cold. She turned to Chenoa, who stood already, shoulders squared, though his strength was not yet whole. He glanced at her rifle on the mantel, then back at her. For a long moment, neither moved. The wind howled, the men outside cursed, and the fire cracked as if urging her to choose. Hazel's hands trembled as she reached for the rifle. She did not point it at Chenoa but at the door, her breath unsteady. He watched her with unreadable eyes, and in them she saw not fear, not plea, but a quiet readiness to stand beside her if she would let him. Her voice faltered, yet it rose enough to carry above the storm. "Go home, Elias. You'll not drive him out. Not while I draw breath." Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of wind. Then the mutter of retreating boots, the dimming of lantern light. Hazel's knees weakened with relief and terror. She lowered the rifle slowly, her body trembling from the defiance she had never thought herself capable of. When she turned back, Chenoa was watching her with an expression she could not mistake: respect. He stepped closer, close enough that the firelight revealed every line of his scarred face. For a moment she thought he might speak, might tell her what flickered in his gaze. Instead, he reached past her to place another log on the fire, the crackle of flame swelling like a heartbeat. Hazel's chest ached with unspoken words. She wanted to demand what this meant, what would come of the path she had chosen. But the storm roared louder, and the only answer lay in the silence they shared, bound now by her defiance as much as by mercy. As she sank into the rocker, the firelight casting long shadows, she realized with a shiver that she had crossed a threshold she could never step back from. The town would not forget. And Chenoa, with his quiet watchful eyes, was no longer merely a guest in her cabin. He was part of her fate. And when he finally spoke, voice low and rough as stone ground by river, it carried the weight of promise and peril alike. No leave. Snow pressed hard against the cabin walls, a steady hiss like the breath of some vast animal prowling just outside. Hazel lay awake on her narrow bed, staring into the dim glow of embers. The storm had quieted after midnight, but her mind churned without rest. The words Elias Boone had thrown at her still burned, threats not made idly. By morning, the town would whisper louder than ever, and men would gather their courage behind lanterns and guns. She had chosen, and now the choice would be tested. She rose before dawn, the room blue with cold. Chenoa was already awake, seated by the hearth, sharpening a hunting knife with slow, steady strokes. He did not look up as she moved about, but the rhythm of stone against steel filled the silence like a heartbeat. Hazel stoked the fire, set water to boil, and forced her hands not to tremble. When she finally glanced his way, his gaze lifted to hers, calm and resolute. "They'll come," she said, her voice breaking in the quiet. He nodded once, as though he had always known. "We stand." The words were simple, halting, yet they rang through her chest with the weight of an oath. For a moment she could only stare at him. The man she had dragged from the snow, the man she had feared, the man she now trusted more than her own kin. She nodded, unable to find words, and turned back to the pot before her tears could show. By midday, the storm had cleared. The sky was a brittle blue, the kind that promised no mercy, and the snow reflected light so sharp it hurt the eyes. Hazel watched from the window as distant figures began to gather. Lanterns bobbed, rifles gleamed, voices carried faint through the frozen air. Elias Boone's shout broke above the rest, bitter and triumphant. "Hazel! Time's done. Send him out, or we'll come in." Her breath stilled. She turned, finding Chenoa already on his feet, shoulders squared though his body still bore the toll of storm and hunger. He pulled the cloak tighter across him, then reached for the axe resting near the door. Hazel stepped between him and the threshold, her heart hammering. "If you fight, they'll kill you. They'll kill us both." Chenoa's eyes held hers, dark and unyielding. "If no fight, same." She felt the truth of it strike deep. These men had not come for justice, only for cruelty cloaked as protection. They would not leave until blood or shame had been spilled. Her hands went to the rifle on the mantel. She lifted it, the weight foreign yet steadying. The door shook as a boot struck it, then again harder. Hazel's pulse thundered. She stepped closer to Chenoa, close enough to feel the heat of his breath in the frozen air. His hand brushed hers briefly, not to take the rifle, but to lend strength. That brief touch steadied her more than any sermon ever could. The door burst open, Elias Boone first through, his face twisted with cold and anger. Behind him came three others, rifles raised, voices snarling in the cramped space. Hazel lifted her weapon, though her hands shook, though she had never fired at a man in her life. "Step aside," Elias barked. "We'll drag him out. You'll thank us later." Her voice rose, raw and desperate, but clear. "No. He stays." The room froze, the words hanging like frost in the air. Elias laughed, a harsh sound. A widow shaming herself for a savage. Folk'll spit when they hear. Hazel's cheeks burned, yet she did not lower the rifle. Behind her, she felt Chenoa's presence, immovable, like a mountain at her back. "Better spit than stand with cowards," she whispered, though her voice trembled. Elias lunged forward, hands snapping for the barrel. In an instant, Chenoa moved, the axe swinging up, not to strike, but to force Elias back. The men cursed, rifles wavering. For a heartbeat the room balanced on the edge of violence, breath and steel and firelight tangling together. Then the first shot cracked. Smoke filled the cabin, ears rang. Hazel staggered. The ball thudded into the doorframe inches from her head. She cried out, more from shock than fear, and in that instant Chenoa roared. Not words, but a sound that shook the very air. He surged forward, axe flashing, striking the rifle from a man's grip. The others faltered, startled by his fury, and Hazel seized the moment. She fired, the recoil slamming into her shoulder. The shot went wide, but it tore a hole through the window and sent shards of glass across the floor. "Out!" Elias bellowed, stumbling back. "We'll burn the place if we have to." The men spilled into the yard, boots crunching in the snow. Chenoa barred the door with a heavy beam, chest heaving, eyes burning with fire Hazel had not seen before. She dropped the rifle, hands shaking so badly she could barely breathe. He turned to her, grasped her arms, steadying her. "Strong," he said, voice hoarse but certain. Tears blurred her vision. She wanted to collapse, to give in to the weight of it, but his hands held her firm, grounding her. She nodded, breath ragged. Outside, the men regrouped, shouts rising. Lantern light flickered through the cracks, the promise of fire hovering like a curse. Hazel stepped to the window, raising her voice. "If you burn this house, you burn me with it. You'll kill a woman who's done you no wrong." The words carried across the frozen yard, silencing the mob for a moment. Elias's voice came back, scornful but uncertain. "Then you choose him over us?" Hazel swallowed hard. Her voice steadied. "I choose mercy. I choose my own soul." The silence stretched, heavy as snow. Then boots crunched, one by one, retreating into the trees. Elias cursed, his words scattering into the wind. At last, only the hush of winter remained. Hazel sagged against the sill, breath rushing out in relief. She turned to find Chenoa still watching her, his expression unreadable yet softened at the edges. Slowly, he stepped close, close enough that the firelight revealed every line of his scarred face. His voice came low, rough as stone worn by river. "You fight for me?" She shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "I fought for myself. For what they tried to take." His hand lifted, hesitated, then brushed a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that undid her. She trembled, not from fear but from the weight of all she had carried alone. He whispered then, words sure and steady. "You're mine now." The fire snapped, shadows swaying. Hazel closed her eyes, letting the words sink deep, terrifying and tender all at once. When she opened them, she saw not a stranger, not an outcast, but a man bound to her by storm and defiance, by silence and mercy. She did not speak, but her hand found his and she held on. Outside, the snow fell again, soft and relentless, burying tracks, covering scars, sealing their stand into memory. And though she knew the town's judgment would not fade, Hazel felt something stir within her chest. A strength she had not known was hers, a flame no storm could smother. The cabin walls groaned in the cold, but within them burned a fire fierce enough to outlast winter, fierce enough to defy shame. And as she leaned into the silence beside him, the world outside seemed to fall away, leaving only the unyielding truth of what had been claimed.